Some discoveries arrive too late. Others arrive precisely when they are meant to, even if that moment comes at the end of everything. England, 1842. The spring afternoon light filtered through the tall windows of Lady Pembroke's Mayfair townhouse, casting geometric shadows across the polished parquet floor where 20 orphaned children stood arranged in careful rows. Vivian Hartley moved among them with quiet purpose, adjusting the collar of a small boy's worn jacket, whispering encouragement to a nervous girl clutching sheet music with trembling fingers. At 8 and 20, Vivian had grown accustomed to moving through London society as a shadow, present but largely unnoticed, her noble lineage carefully concealed beneath the respectable title of companion to Lady Pembroke. "Stand tall, Thomas," she murmured to the smallest child, a boy of perhaps 6 years whose eyes were wide with apprehension. "Remember, you are sharing a gift today. There is no shame in that, only pride." The boy's shoulders straightened fractionally, and Vivian felt a familiar warmth in her chest. These children, residents of the Hartwick Home for Foundlings, had practiced for weeks to perform at Lady Pembroke's annual charitable musicale. The event drew London's elite, those with deep pockets and shallow interest in the actual beneficiaries of their generosity. Vivian had learned to navigate such gatherings with diplomatic precision, ensuring the children were seen as worthy recipients rather than objects of pity. "Miss Hartley," Lady Pembroke's voice cut through the quiet preparations, sharp with the authority of a woman who had never been denied anything she desired. "The guests are arriving. Do ensure the children remain orderly. Lord Ashton specifically requested we avoid any unseemly displays." "Of course, my lady," Vivian replied, dropping a slight curtsy that still felt foreign after 3 years of performing such gestures to a woman who had once been her social equal. Lady Pembroke swept away in a rustle of emerald silk, leaving behind the cloying scent of French perfume. Vivian returned her attention to the children, leading them through a final run-through of their opening hymn. Their voices, though untrained, held a purity that no amount of expensive instruction could manufacture. The drawing room gradually filled with elegantly dressed ladies and gentlemen, their conversation a low hum of gossip and social positioning. Vivian had positioned herself near the pianoforte, ready to signal the children when Lady Pembroke gave the indication to begin. She kept her gaze carefully neutral, neither seeking attention nor shrinking from view, a balance she had perfected through necessity. It was then that she noticed him. Adrian Claymore, Duke of Windermere, stood framed in the doorway, with an air of quiet authority that needed no announcement. At 34, he cut an imposing figure, tall and broad-shouldered, his dark brown hair swept back from a face that classical sculptors might have envied. Unlike many of his peers who wore their status with aggressive ostentation, the Duke carried himself with a reserved dignity that somehow commanded more respect than any amount of peacocking could achieve. Vivian had heard of the Duke naturally. One could not move through even the periphery of London society without encountering whispered speculation about why such an eligible man remained unmarried. What drove him to eschew the endless parade of social engagements that consumed his peers? Some claimed he was impossibly selective, others suggested a tragic past attachment. Vivian had paid such gossip little mind, having learned through bitter experience that society's narratives rarely aligned with truth. Lady Pembroke rushed forward to greet her distinguished guest, her pleasure evident in the heightened colour in her cheeks. The Duke responded with impeccable courtesy, though Vivian noticed his gaze drift from his hostess to survey the assembled company. For one brief moment, his eyes met hers across the crowded room, and something indefinable passed between them before he returned his attention to Lady Pembroke's effusive welcome. The musicale began precisely at 3 o'clock. The children performed admirably, their voices rising in harmony despite the intimidating audience. Vivian watched them with fierce pride, noting how young Thomas remembered to breathe between phrases, how Sarah held her pitch despite her earlier nervousness. When they concluded their final piece, the applause was generous, though Vivian suspected it was more for the attendees' own charitable virtue than genuine appreciation of the children's effort. As the guests moved toward the refreshment tables, Vivian began organising the children for their departure. It was during this distraction that she heard a muffled sound of distress from near the terrace doors. Years of caring for others had honed her instincts, and she turned immediately to identify the source. The Duke of Windermere stood partially concealed by a marble column, one hand pressed against his chest, his face drained of colour. The transformation from commanding presence to man in obvious pain occurred so swiftly that Vivian wondered if anyone else had noticed. A quick glance confirmed that the other guests remained absorbed in their own conversations, blissfully unaware of the drama unfolding mere feet away. Vivian moved without conscious thought, crossing to him with swift efficiency while maintaining the appearance of casual movement. "Your Grace," she said quietly, positioning herself to shield him from curious eyes. "You require air, I believe. The terrace is just through these doors." He looked at her with surprise evident in his deep blue eyes, but nodded shortly. She opened the French doors and guided him onto the stone terrace overlooking Lady Pembroke's modest garden. The afternoon air held a spring freshness that seemed to revive him slightly, though his breathing remained laboured. "Should I summon a physician?" Vivian asked, her tone matter-of-fact rather than panicked. "No," he managed, his voice strained. "It will pass. It always does." The resignation in those last words caught her attention, but she made no comment, simply standing near enough to assist if needed, while maintaining a respectful distance. Several minutes passed in silence, broken only by the muted sounds of the gathering inside and the Duke's gradually steadying breath. "You are Lady Pembroke's companion," he said finally, straightening as colour returned to his features. "I am, Your Grace." "Yet you moved to assist me without hesitation, drawing no attention to my condition." "You clearly wish to avoid notice," Vivian replied simply. It seemed the courteous response. A smile touched his lips, brief but genuine. Most women of my acquaintance would have either ignored my distress entirely or made a grand production of rendering aid to demonstrate their compassionate nature before witnesses. "I am not most women of your acquaintance, Your Grace." "No," he agreed, studying her with an intensity that made her suddenly conscious of her plain dove-grey dress, the simplicity of her appearance compared to the elaborate fashions inside. "I suspect you are not. Tell me, Miss Hartley." "Vivienne Hartley." Something flickered in his expression. "Hartley, the daughter of Viscount Hartley." She felt her spine stiffen defensively. "I am, though the title died with my father. His estate, such as it was, passed to a distant cousin. I knew your father slightly. He was a man of principle, though perhaps not of sound financial judgment. It was a kinder assessment than most offered. My father believed the best of people, Your Grace. It was both his greatest virtue and his ultimate downfall." The Duke nodded slowly. "You speak of him with affection rather than bitterness. That suggests strength of character." "Or merely acceptance of realities beyond my control," Vivian countered, uncomfortable with the personal turn their conversation had taken. Before he could respond, Lady Pembroke's voice called from inside, seeking her companion. Vivian turned toward the sound, but the Duke spoke once more. "Thank you, Miss Hartley, for your discretion." She inclined her head and returned to the gathering, aware of his gaze following her retreat. The remainder of the afternoon passed in the usual manner. The children were dispatched back to the foundling home with a basket of cakes and a modest purse of coins collected from the guests. Vivian endured Lady Pembroke's endless commentary on who had worn what, who had spoken to whom, what slight or triumph each interaction represented in the complex social calculus of their world. 3 days later, as Vivian sat in the morning room mending one of Lady Pembroke's innumerable shawls, the butler announced an unexpected caller. His Grace, the Duke of Windermere, to see Lady Pembroke. Vivian's needle stilled mid-stitch. Through the open doorway, she watched Lady Pembroke's face transform with delighted surprise as she received the Duke in her formal drawing room. Vivian remained where she was, assuming the visit had nothing to do with her, until Lady Pembroke's voice summoned her with barely contained excitement. "Miss Hartley, come at once!" She entered to find the Duke standing by the fireplace, his expression unreadable. Lady Pembroke practically vibrated with suppressed energy. "My dear Miss Hartley, His Grace has made the most extraordinary request. He wishes to engage your services. Vivienne's confusion must have shown, for the Duke stepped forward. I find myself in need of someone to organize my library at Windermere Manor and to undertake a rather specialized project. Lady Pembroke speaks highly of your organizational skills and your education. I am prepared to offer generous compensation for approximately 6 months of service. The library, Your Grace? Vivienne repeated, struggling to comprehend this unexpected development. Among other tasks, he replied. The position would require residence at my estate in Kent. All arrangements would be entirely proper, naturally. My housekeeper maintains strict standards. Lady Pembroke, never one to miss an opportunity for advantage, immediately began negotiations regarding compensation and terms. Vivienne stood silently, her mind racing. Why would a duke personally seek to employ a companion for library work? Surely his steward could hire any number of qualified individuals. Yet here he stood, awaiting her response to an offer she had not solicited. I confess myself surprised, Your Grace, Vivienne said, when Lady Pembroke finally paused for breath. Surely there are others more qualified. Perhaps, he acknowledged, but I require someone specific, someone capable of discretion. The emphasis on that final word carried weight she did not yet understand. Lady Pembroke, however, recognized opportunity when it presented itself. Miss Hartley would be delighted to accept, Your Grace. When would you require her to begin? Within the week, if possible. And so it was decided, with a speed that left Vivienne's head spinning. That evening, she wrote to her sister Margaret, informing her of the change in circumstances. Margaret's response arrived the following morning. A brief note expressing relief that Vivienne had secured independent employment and would no longer be a financial burden on Margaret's household. The words stung, though Vivienne had long since grown accustomed to her sister's resentment. The journey to Windermere Manor commenced on a crisp morning that promised fair weather. The Duke's carriage was comfortable, appointed with understated luxury. For the first hour, they travelled in relative silence, exchanging only occasional observations about the countryside. It was as they passed into Kent that the Duke finally spoke with purpose. Miss Hartley, I have not been entirely forthcoming about my reasons for engaging your services. She turned from the window to regard him fully. I suspected as much, Your Grace. The library does require organization, and I do wish to document the history of Windermere and its people. But there is another reason, a more personal one, that I must share before we arrive. Something in his tone made her breath catch. He held her gaze steadily, and she saw in his eyes a vulnerability that the powerful rarely revealed. 6 months ago, I consulted physicians in London and Edinburgh regarding a persistent weakness, episodes similar to what you witnessed at Lady Pembroke's gathering. Their conclusions were unanimous. I have a congenital weakness of the heart, the same condition that claimed my father at 40 years and my grandfather at 38. Vivienne felt the blood drain from her face. Your Grace. They have given me approximately 6 months, perhaps slightly more if I am fortunate. I am telling you this because I cannot in good conscience bring you to Windermere under false pretenses. The work I am asking you to undertake is not merely organization. It is the preservation of a legacy before I am no longer here to ensure it myself. The carriage continued its steady progress through the Kent countryside, but Vivienne felt as though the world had tilted on its axis. Before her sat a man of 34, vital and seemingly robust, calmly discussing his own imminent death. Why me? She asked finally. Why not family, friends, someone of your own circle? Because you have already demonstrated the one quality I need above all others, he replied. That afternoon on the terrace, you saw a man in distress, not a duke to be leveraged for social advantage. You acted without calculation or performance. And because you have nothing to gain from gossiping about my condition to society, your position protects my privacy as much as my offer protects your future. It was brutally honest, and Vivienne appreciated the lack of artifice. And if I choose to return to London, then I will have the carriage turn around immediately and trouble you no further. But I hope you will consider staying. The compensation I mentioned includes not merely payment for services rendered, but a permanent fund that will ensure your independence regardless of what becomes of me. Vivienne looked out at the rolling hills, considering. She could return to Margaret's cold hospitality, to Lady Pembroke's casual condescension, to a life lived in the margins of others' stories. Or she could spend 6 months helping a dying man find meaning in his final days, while securing her own future in the process. "I will stay," she said quietly. The Duke's relief was evident, though he merely nodded his acknowledgement. As Windermere Manor came into view on the horizon, its pale stone walls gleaming in the afternoon sun, Vivian wondered what she had truly agreed to, and whether 6 months would prove to be enough time for all that needed to be done. Neither of them spoke of the unacknowledged truth already taking root between them, that some connections form not over years but in heartbeats, and that the shadow of mortality could make every moment luminous with significance. Windermere Manor rose from the Kent countryside like a monument to generations past, its honey-coloured stone walls glowing softly in the late afternoon light. The approach down the tree-lined drive allowed Vivian her first comprehensive view of the estate that would be her home for the coming months. The main house stretched across 3 connected wings, its Georgian architecture speaking of wealth tempered by restraint. Formal gardens extended from the southern facade, their neat hedgerows and gravel paths arranged with geometric precision, while beyond them rolled parkland dotted with ancient oaks. "It was built by my great-grandfather," Adrian said, following her gaze. He believed a duke's residence should reflect permanence and stability. Ironic, given that his own son would die at 38, followed by my father at 40. There was no self-pity in his tone, merely the recitation of facts he had long since accepted. Vivian studied his profile as the carriage drew closer to the house, noting the tension around his eyes that suggested acceptance came at a cost most would never comprehend. The household staff assembled on the front steps presented a picture of careful order. Mrs. Thornwell, the housekeeper, stood at their head, a woman of perhaps 55 with silver-threaded hair, and the bearing of one accustomed to absolute authority within her domain. Her assessment of Vivian was swift and thorough, though her curtsy remained impeccably proper. "Welcome to Windermere, Miss Hartley. His Grace has informed me of your purpose here. Your chambers have been prepared in the East Wing. Thank you, Mrs. Thornwell. I appreciate your hospitality." The interior of Windermere proved as impressive as its exterior promised. Marble floors gleamed beneath Vivian's feet, as Adrian led her through a succession of formal rooms, each appointed with furniture and artwork that spoke of accumulated wealth rather than ostentatious display. Yet despite its grandeur, something melancholy hung in the air, as though the house itself mourned its dying master. "The library is through here," Adrian said, opening double doors that revealed a 2-story chamber lined floor to ceiling with books. Tall windows flooded the space with natural light, illuminating leather spines in shades of burgundy, forest green, and midnight blue. Vivian's breath caught. She had seen impressive private collections before, but never one that so clearly reflected genuine scholarship rather than mere decoration. "Your Grace, this is magnificent. My father collected extensively, as did his father before him. I have continued the tradition, though I fear much of it remains uncatalogued." He moved to one of the windows overlooking the gardens. "This is where I spend most of my time. This room has always felt more like home than any formal chamber in the house." "Then we shall ensure its contents are properly preserved," Vivian replied, already scanning the shelves with an archivist's eye. "Though, if I might be frank, Your Grace, I suspect the documentation you mentioned extends beyond mere library organization." Adrian turned to face her fully, and in the afternoon light, she saw the shadows beneath his eyes that cosmetics and careful grooming nearly concealed. "You are perceptive, Miss Hartley." "Yes, there is more. My family's history with this particular affliction began with my grandfather, Thomas Claymore, who collapsed during a hunt at 38. My father, Richard, made it to 40 before his heart finally surrendered during what should have been a routine morning ride. And the physicians believe you face the same fate." "They do. I consulted specialists in London first, then travelled to Edinburgh to seek a second opinion. Dr. Pembridge in London was most thorough. He examined me extensively and reviewed detailed accounts of both my father's and grandfather's symptoms before their deaths. The pattern, he assured me, was unmistakable." Vivian moved closer, studying his face with the same directness she had shown on Lady Pembroke's terrace. "Yet you appear robust, Your Grace. Apart from that episode I witnessed, I see no obvious signs of debility." "That is the cruelty of it," Adrian replied quietly. "For weeks, even months, I seem perfectly well. Then without warning, my heart races uncontrollably, or conversely, beats so slowly I can barely remain conscious. The episodes are growing more frequent. 6 months ago, I might go weeks between incidents. Now, scarcely a fortnight passes without some manifestation. Have the physicians offered no treatment at all? Rest, they say. Avoid excitement or exertion. Accept the inevitable with grace." His mouth twisted bitterly. "In other words, live as an invalid and wait for death. I tried that for nearly a year, Miss Hartley, and found it more unbearable than the prospect of dying itself, which is why I have brought you here." He crossed to his desk and withdrew a leather portfolio. "These are the matters requiring attention. My will needs updating with specific provisions for the estate's future. My cousin Marcus stands to inherit the title, but I have concerns about his stewardship of the land, and more importantly, the people who depend upon it. I need to establish legal protections that will survive my death." Vivienne accepted the portfolio, thumbing through documents dense with legal terminology. "You have no closer heir? No brother or uncle?" "None. Marcus is my father's sister's son, our nearest male relation. He visited last Christmas and made his views on estate management abundantly clear. He sees Windermere primarily as a source of revenue to fund his London lifestyle. The tenant farmers, the village, the history of this place, these matter nothing to him." "Then we must ensure they are protected," Vivienne said firmly. "Though I confess, Your Grace, my expertise lies more in organisation than legal manoeuvring. Which brings me to the second part of your purpose here." Adrian gestured to the shelves surrounding them. "These books chronicle centuries of history, but they are silent on the most important stories. The people who have lived on and worked this land. My tenants, their families, the generations who have called Windermere home. Their experiences exist only in memory. When I am gone, who will preserve those narratives?" Understanding dawned. "You wish to document their stories, create an oral history of the estate." "Precisely. I want Windermere's legacy to be more than legal documents and property boundaries. I want it to be the people who gave it life." For the first time since their conversation began, genuine animation lit his features. "Do you think such a thing possible in the time available?" "I think it not only possible but essential," Vivienne replied, warming to the project. "Every estate has its history, but few take the time to preserve the human element. This could be remarkable, Your Grace." They spent the remainder of that first afternoon discussing logistics. Adrian provided maps of the estate, lists of tenant families, and historical documents that would provide context. Vivienne took notes in a leather-bound journal he presented her, her mind already organising the work ahead. That evening, after a quiet dinner served in a small dining room rather than the formal hall, Vivienne retreated to her chambers to compose a letter to Margaret. She kept the details sparse, mentioning only that she had secured a position organising a duke's private library and documenting estate history. The generous compensation, she noted carefully, would allow her complete independence upon the project's conclusion. Margaret's response arrived within the week, delivered along with the regular post. Vivienne broke the seal with fingers that trembled slightly, knowing what she would find, yet hoping for something more. "Dear Vivienne," the letter began without preamble, "your news brings relief to our household. Thomas has been quite vocal about the expense of maintaining you here, and while I assured him it was temporary, his patience had begun to wear thin. That you have secured independent employment reflects well upon you. I trust you will conduct yourself with the propriety our family name requires. Your sister, Margaret. No inquiry after her well-being, no expression of concern about her living in the household of an unmarried duke. Simply relief at being unburdened." Vivienne folded the letter carefully and placed it in her desk drawer, where it would serve as a reminder that she had no home to return to beyond what she created for herself. The first week at Windermere established patterns that would define the months ahead. Mornings, Vivienne worked in the library, creating a cataloguing system that would survive her departure. The collection proved even more extensive than initial examination suggested, ranging from medical texts to classical literature, agricultural treatises to philosophical works. Adrian joined her frequently, ostensibly to provide information about specific volumes, but more often simply to talk. Their conversations ranged widely. He spoke of his education at Oxford, his travels through Italy and Greece before his condition manifested, his frustrations with parliamentary politics and the slow pace of agricultural reform. She shared her own love of literature, her observations on London society, her thoughts on the social reforms slowly reshaping England. The ease with which they conversed surprised them both, as though they had known each other far longer than mere days. "You should have been a scholar," Adrian observed one morning as Vivian explained her organisational system. "Your mind is too sharp to be wasted as a companion to someone like Lady Pembroke. Circumstance rarely consults our preferences, Your Grace. Besides, I find satisfaction in bringing order to chaos. There is beauty in a well-organised library. Call me Adrian," he said suddenly. "We shall be working closely for months. Such formality seems unnecessary in private." Vivian hesitated, then nodded. "Adrian, then, though only when we are alone. I have no wish to scandalise Mrs. Thornwell." His laugh held genuine amusement. "Mrs. Thornwell has served this family for 30 years. I suspect very little scandalises her at this point." The afternoons brought different work. Together, they began visiting the tenant farms that dotted the estate. Adrian had warned her that physical exertion came at a cost, and she witnessed the truth of this during their second excursion. They had walked perhaps a mile to reach the Whitmore farm when his steps faltered, his breathing growing laboured. "A moment," he said quietly, leaning against the stone wall bordering the road. Vivian waited without comment, noting how he pressed one hand against his chest, his face draining of colour. Several minutes passed before his breathing steadied and the colour returned. "It passes more quickly now," he said, anticipating her unspoken question. "In the beginning, such episodes left me incapacitated for hours. The body adapts, it seems, even to dying." The Whitmores received them with warm hospitality, despite the obvious poverty of their circumstances. Samuel Whitmore, a man weathered by 6 decades of farm labour, spoke with pride of how 3 generations of his family had worked Windermere land. His wife, Mary, served tea in chipped porcelain cups, apologising for the modest offering. "None of that, Mary," Adrian said gently. "Your hospitality honours us." Vivian took notes as Samuel shared stories of past harvests, of Adrian's grandfather's generosity during a particularly harsh winter, of the sense of community that bound the estate's families together. When they departed, Adrian pressed coins into Samuel's hand despite the older man's protests. "That was kind," Vivian observed as they walked back toward the main house. "It was necessary," Adrian corrected. "The Whitmores have given this estate decades of loyal service. The least I can do is ensure their remaining years are comfortable. Marcus would not do the same." "No, he would not." His jaw tightened, which is why these protections matter so deeply. These people deserve better than a landlord who sees them merely as sources of income. That night, after Adrian had retired, Vivian remained in the library, transcribing her notes into a clean record. She worked by candlelight, the house silent around her, when she heard a heavy thud from the direction of Adrian's chambers. She reached his door in seconds, knocking sharply. "Adrian? Your Grace?" No response came. Without further hesitation, she pushed the door open to find him collapsed beside his bed, his nightshirt soaked with perspiration, his breathing shallow and erratic. "Adrian." She knelt beside him, pressing her fingers to his throat to feel his pulse. It fluttered beneath her touch, rapid and weak. His eyes opened, unfocused. "Vivian?" "I am here. Can you sit up?" Together they managed to get him back to the bed. Vivian called for Mrs. Thornwell, who appeared with remarkable speed given the hour, carrying fresh linens and a basin of cool water. "It has happened before," the housekeeper said quietly. "I will fetch Dr. Pembridge's tonic." "No." Adrian's voice, though weak, held authority. "The tonic merely makes me sleep. I would rather endure this conscious. Then we stay with you, Vivian said firmly, wringing out a cloth to place on his forehead. Mrs. Thornwell, perhaps some weak tea. The housekeeper nodded and withdrew. Vivian remained, applying cool compresses, monitoring his breathing, speaking quietly about inconsequential matters to keep him anchored to consciousness. Gradually, over the course of hours, his colour improved and his breathing steadied. Dawn was breaking when his eyes finally focused clearly on her face. You stayed. Of course I stayed. You should be resting. Your work can wait, she interrupted. Adrian, we need to establish something immediately. During these episodes, I will assist you. There will be no argument, no embarrassment, no masculine pride preventing you from accepting help. Is that understood? He stared at her, this woman he had known less than a fortnight, who now sat beside his bed with her hair coming loose from its pins and exhaustion evident in her features, yet spoke with absolute authority. And if I refuse? Then I return to London on the next coach. I will not watch you suffer alone out of misplaced propriety. Either you accept my assistance, or you find someone else to organise your legacy. A slow smile spread across his face despite his obvious fatigue. You are remarkably fierce, Miss Hartley. I am remarkably practical, Your Grace. Now do we have an understanding? We do. Good. Then rest. Actual rest, not simply lying awake worrying about all that needs doing. I shall be in the library should you need anything. As she rose to leave, his hand caught hers briefly. Thank you, Vivienne. Truly. She squeezed his fingers gently before departing, leaving him to the sleep that would finally claim him. In the library, she sank into a chair and allowed herself a moment of vulnerability, her hands trembling with the aftermath of fear she had not permitted herself to show. 6 months, perhaps less. The reality of his condition had manifested with brutal clarity in those dark hours. Yet even as dread filled her heart, Vivian felt something else stirring, a fierce determination that those months would matter, that Adrian would leave behind more than mere documents and property. He would leave behind a legacy worthy of the man he was, not simply the title he bore. And she would ensure it, whatever the cost to her own carefully guarded heart. The second month at Windermere arrived with the particular gentleness of early summer, when the Kent countryside wore its richest green and the morning air carried the fragrance of roses from the formal gardens. Vivienne had settled into patterns that gave structure to days otherwise shadowed by the knowledge of their finite nature. Mornings belonged to the library. She arrived each day shortly after breakfast, the tall windows already flooding the space with crystalline light. Her cataloguing system had evolved into something both practical and elegant, each volume recorded with its publication details, condition, and significance within the collection. Adrian often joined her by mid-morning, ostensibly to answer questions about particular works, but increasingly, she suspected, simply for her company. My father acquired that during his grand tour, he said one morning, watching as she examined a leather-bound volume of Italian poetry. Venice, 1806. He claimed Byron himself recommended it, though I suspect that was embellishment. It is beautiful regardless of provenance, Vivian replied, turning pages yellowed by decades but still crisp. The binding alone suggests it was treasured. As it should be. Adrian moved to the window, his silhouette dark against the brightness beyond. My father believed books were meant to be read, not merely displayed. Every volume in this library has been opened, studied, argued over. That was his true legacy, not the acres or the title. There was wistfulness in his tone that Vivian had learned to recognize. In their weeks together, she had come to understand the layers of grief he carried, not merely for his own approaching death, but for the father and grandfather who had preceded him into that same darkness. The Claymore men, it seemed, were cursed to see the pattern of their own demise written in family history. The afternoons brought different work. After luncheon, they ventured onto the estate, sometimes on foot when Adrian's strength permitted, other times in the smaller carriage that allowed them to cover greater distances. The oral history project had begun to take genuine shape. Vivian's journals now contained the voices of 3 generations of tenant families, their recollections creating a tapestry of daily life, seasonal rhythms, hardships endured and joys celebrated. At the Whitmore cottage, old Samuel had shared memories of the great storm of 1831, when the Duke's grandfather had opened the manor's stores to every family on the estate. "We would have starved else," Samuel recalled, his weathered hands wrapped around a cup of tea. His Grace knew what it meant to care for folk depending on him. The Reeves family spoke of Adrian's own quiet kindnesses, the physician sent during their daughter's fever, the reduction in rent during their worst harvest. His Grace never made a show of it, Mrs. Reeves confided to Vivian while Adrian rested on the porch. "But we remember. Every family here remembers." These testimonies moved Adrian deeply, though he spoke little of his reactions. Vivian observed how he would fall silent on their return journeys, his gaze distant, as though measuring his own life against the accumulated gratitude of those he had served. One evening, after a particularly long day visiting farms in the western reaches of the estate, they lingered in the library rather than retiring immediately after dinner. The summer twilight stretched long, painting the room in shades of amber and rose. "I have lived 34 years, Adrian said suddenly, breaking a comfortable silence, "and spent most of them preparing to die. My father's death when I was 14 taught me to expect the same fate. When the physicians confirmed my condition 3 years ago, I felt almost vindicated. The waiting was over." Vivian set down her pen, giving him her full attention. "You sound as though death was a relief. In a sense, it was. Not the dying itself, but the certainty. I refused to marry because I could not bear to leave a widow to grieve. I avoided deep friendships for the same reason. I managed my estates responsibly, but took no pleasure in them. I existed, Miss Hartley, but I did not live." The formality of her name on his lips felt jarring after weeks of increasing ease between them. "Why tell me this?" He turned from the window to face her directly. "Because you have shown me the difference. In these weeks, I have felt more alive than in all the years preceding them. The work we do together, the conversations we share, even the simple act of reading in companionable silence, these have awakened something I thought long dead." Vivian felt her throat tighten. "Adrian, I am merely helping you document what already exists. You are doing far more than that, and you know it." He crossed to where she sat, his expression earnest. "Tell me honestly, Vivian, what dreams did you abandon when circumstance forced you into Lady Pembroke's household?" The question caught her unprepared. She looked down at her ink-stained fingers, considering how much truth to offer. "I wanted to travel," she admitted finally, "to see the great cathedrals of Europe, walk along the Mediterranean, visit the libraries of Florence and Rome. I wanted to learn languages, not from books, but from speakers. I wanted—" She stopped, recognizing the futility of such confession. "You wanted a life of your own choosing, not one dictated by financial necessity." "Yes, though I recognize such desires were always impractical. Women of my position do not embark on grand tours." Adrian was quiet for a moment, then spoke with sudden intensity. "I have a proposal for you, Vivienne. Not the conventional kind," he added with a fleeting smile, "but something equally binding in its way." She waited, pulse quickening. "You agreed to 6 months in my service organizing my legacy. I am asking for something additional. I am asking you to teach me to live in the time remaining. And in return, I will ensure that when I am gone, you have the means to pursue every dream you just described. Adrian, you are already paying me generously. This goes beyond compensation for services rendered." He pulled a chair close to hers, speaking with quiet urgency. "I will establish a permanent fund in your name, substantial enough to provide complete independence. You will never need to rely on Margaret's grudging charity or another employer's whims. But more than that, I will make certain you have the resources to travel, to study, to live as you choose. All I ask is that you stay these 6 months and show me how to make them count." Vivian stared at him, struggling to comprehend the magnitude of what he offered. "You cannot simply give me such a gift. What will people think?" "I do not care what people think. I have spent years caring about propriety and expectation. And where has it led me? To this library, with death approaching and only now realizing I have wasted the life I was given." His hand covered hers briefly. "Say yes, Vivienne. Help me learn to swim in the lake, to have a proper picnic, to dance for pleasure rather than social obligation. Help me live. The vulnerability in his request undid her careful defenses. Yes, she whispered. I will stay. Relief transformed his features. Thank you. They began the very next day. Adrian had never swum in Windermere's lake, despite growing up with it stretching beyond the south lawn. They walked there on a golden afternoon, Vivian carrying a basket with cold chicken and bread, Adrian moving more slowly than usual, but refusing to acknowledge his limitations. At the water's edge, he hesitated. I should have learned as a boy. My father forbade it, fearing the exertion might trigger an episode. Then your father was overly cautious. The water is calm, and I shall be nearby if needed. He gave her a look of mingled gratitude and apprehension before wading in. Vivian watched from the bank, ready to act if necessary. But Adrian managed well enough, his initial awkwardness giving way to obvious pleasure as he floated on his back, face turned toward the cloudless sky. Other items on their unspoken list followed. They took a picnic beneath the ancient oak on the northern boundary, spreading a blanket and eating bread and cheese like common folk rather than aristocracy. They explored parts of the house Adrian had avoided for years. The old nursery where he had played as a child, the portrait gallery with its succession of claymore faces. One evening, after a simple supper, Adrian led Vivian back to the library. You mentioned once that you played pianoforte. I have been remiss in not inviting you to use the music room. I am terribly out of practice. Then we shall be equally terrible together. I propose a waltz, here among the books, where no one need witness our ineptitude. She laughed despite herself. You wish to dance in the library? Why not? It is my favourite room in the house. Seems fitting to christen it with something other than dusty scholarship. They pushed aside a small table to clear space on the Turkish carpet. Without music, Adrian began to hum a melody Vivian vaguely recognised, taking her hand and placing his other at her waist. The formality of the position contrasted sharply with the absurdity of their location and the growing intimacy between them. They moved clumsily at first, counting steps aloud like children at their first dancing lesson. But gradually, they found a rhythm, turning slowly between the towering shelves, the evening lights slanting through windows and casting them in alternating shadow and gold. You are better than you claimed, Adrian murmured, his breath warm against her temple. You are more accomplished than you suggested, she countered, acutely aware of his hand at her waist, the solid reality of him. They danced until the melody Adrian hummed faded into silence, but neither stepped away immediately. In that suspended moment, Vivian felt the fundamental shift that had been building for weeks. This was no longer simply employment, no longer merely the preservation of legacy. Something deeper had taken root, something that terrified her precisely because she understood its impossibility. Thank you, Adrian said quietly, still holding her hand. For all of this, for staying. Where else would I be? She meant it lightly, but the words emerged with unmistakable sincerity. He released her then, stepping back with obvious reluctance. It grows late. I should not keep you from your rest. That night, Vivian lay awake in her chambers, staring at the ceiling and acknowledging what she had been avoiding for days. She was falling in love with a dying man. Every conversation, every shared moment, every glimpse of the person Adrian might have been had he not lived under death's shadow. All of it drew her deeper into feelings she had no right to harbour. The crisis came 3 days later. Adrian had insisted on accompanying her to interview the miller's family, despite appearing more fatigued than usual. On the return walk, still half a mile from the manor, his steps faltered. Adrian? A moment. His voice was strained, one hand pressed to his chest. It will pass. But it did not pass. His breathing grew laboured, his face draining of colour as he leaned heavily against a fence post. Vivian moved to support him, her heart racing with fear. She forced herself to suppress. We must get you home. Can you walk if I help? Yes, I think so. The journey back took twice as long as it should have, Adrian leaning on Vivian's shoulder, stopping frequently to catch his breath. By the time they reached the manor, he was barely conscious. Mrs. Thornwell took one look and sent for Dr. Pembridge, while Vivian helped Adrian to his chambers. She remained with him through the afternoon and into evening, monitoring his laboured breathing, applying cool compresses, reading aloud from whatever book lay nearest when he seemed conscious enough to hear. Mrs. Thornwell brought tea that went untouched. The housekeeper's expression held concern but not surprise. This was clearly not the first such episode she had witnessed. Dr. Pembridge arrived as dusk settled over Windermere. His examination was thorough and his prognosis grim. The heart is weakening faster than anticipated, Miss Hartley. These episodes will increase in frequency and severity. All we can do is keep him comfortable and minimize exertion. After the doctor departed, Adrian opened his eyes fully for the first time in hours. I should not have insisted on that walk. Foolish pride. Hush, you are awake and breathing. That is all that matters at present. You stayed. Wonder coloured his weak voice. Her brows lifted. We have already argued this once, Your Grace, she replied gently. I told you I would not leave you to face these episodes alone. Did you imagine I would rescind my word at the first true test? A faint smile touched his mouth. I am a poor student of my own blessings, it seems. Then consider this another lesson, she said. You are not alone here. Not any more. He studied her for a long moment, the severity of his features softened by exhaustion and something like gratitude. Very well, Miss Hartley. I shall endeavour to remember. See that you do, she murmured. She remained in the chair beside his bed until he slept, then slipped quietly from the room. In the hallway, she pressed her back against the wall and allowed herself a moment of vulnerability, hands trembling with the aftermath of fear. She was in far deeper than wisdom permitted, but wisdom, Vivian was discovering, had little power against the stubborn insistence of the human heart. The third month at Windermere arrived with a subtle shift in the air, that particular quality of high summer when the days seem suspended between promise and inevitable decline. Adrian's health, while still precarious, had stabilized somewhat following the crisis that had sent Vivian rushing to his side. Yet both understood that stability was temporary, a brief reprieve rather than genuine improvement. They completed items from their unspoken list with deliberate intention, as though each experience carried weight beyond the moment itself. One morning, Adrian announced they would travel to Brighton. The sea, he said simply, as though that single word explained everything. The journey took most of a day, the carriage rattling over increasingly uneven roads as they drew nearer to the coast. Vivian watched the landscape transform from Kent's rolling farmland to the flatter approaches of Sussex, excitement building despite her attempts at composure. At 28, she had never seen the ocean, that vast expanse she had encountered only in books and paintings. Brighton greeted them with salt-tinged air and the raucous cries of gulls. Adrian had secured rooms at a modest inn, nothing that would attract the attention of fashionable society who might recognise the Duke of Windermere travelling unchaperoned with a young woman. For these few days, they would be simply Mr. Claymore and Miss Hartley, a gentleman and his cousin perhaps, visiting the seaside. The fiction felt surprisingly natural. Away from Windermere's formality and the weight of Adrian's title, they moved through the town with an ease impossible in London or even in the villages surrounding the estate. They walked along the shore, Vivian lifting her skirts impractically high to feel the cold water on her ankles, laughing as foam rushed around her feet. It is everything I imagined, she said, breathless with wonder. And nothing like it at all. Adrian stood watching her, his expression unreadable. Tell me what you imagined. Something more savage, I think, more violent. But this is beautiful, wild, yes, but also somehow welcoming. She turned back to the endless blue-grey expanse. One could believe anything is possible standing here. Perhaps it is. Something in his tone made her look at him sharply, but he had already turned away, gazing down the beach toward the distant piers. That evening, they dined at a small establishment Adrian had visited years ago, when he still permitted himself such ordinary pleasures. The proprietor, an elderly woman with kind eyes, fussed over them as though they were family, insisting they try the local fish prepared with herbs from her garden. You make a handsome couple, she said as she cleared their plates. First visit to Brighton together? Yes, Adrian replied before Vivienne could formulate a response. Long overdue. After dinner, they walked along the promenade, joining the evening parade of visitors and residents taking the sea air. Couples strolled arm in arm, children chased each other despite their parents' tired protests. A group of young men laughed too loudly outside a public house. It was ordinary, unremarkable, and for that very reason, precious. Do you know what I envy most about these people? Adrian asked quietly. What? They believe they have time. They make plans for next summer, for years hence, for the future they assume will arrive. They do not wake each morning counting days. Vivienne took his arm, a gesture that felt entirely natural in this place, where they were simply two people walking beside the sea. Then do not count them either. Not tonight. He covered her hand with his. Not tonight. The moment stretched between them, charged with meanings neither dared speak aloud. Adrian turned toward her, his face shadowed in the gaslight from nearby lamps, and Vivienne felt her breath catch. For one suspended instant, she thought he might kiss her, might cross that final boundary between employer and companion, between duke and woman, who had somehow become essential to him. But he merely pressed her hand more firmly against his arm and continued walking. We should return to the inn. Tomorrow I want to show you the pavilion before we depart. The spell broke, but its residue remained, an awareness that hummed between them all through their walk back and into the night beyond. They returned to Windermere 2 days later, the journey passing in companionable conversation about all they had seen. Yet beneath the surface of their discussion about architecture and the peculiar fashions of Brighton society, something had shifted, an intimacy established not through words, but through shared silence, through Vivienne's hand on Adrian's arm, through his careful attention to her comfort and pleasure. Mrs. Thornwell greeted them with her usual efficiency, but Vivienne caught the housekeeper's sharp eyes moving between them, assessing, noting. Nothing would be said, of course. Mrs. Thornwell had served the Claymore family too long to gossip, but she saw, and seeing, would draw her own conclusions. A letter from Margaret waited in Vivienne's chambers. She broke the seal with fingers still slightly stiff from the sea air, scanning her sister's tight script with growing annoyance. Dearest Vivienne, the letter began, though the endearment rang hollow. Thomas has heard rumours from his business associates in London regarding your continued residence at Windermere Manor. While we understand the importance of your employment, surely by now the Duke's library is sufficiently organised. Thomas worries that your extended absence reflects poorly on our family's reputation. When might we expect your return? No inquiry after her well-being. No interest in the work she was accomplishing. Simply concern for reputation and an impatient question about when she would cease being Margaret's problem once more. Vivienne folded the letter carefully and placed it in her desk drawer atop the previous correspondence from her sister. She would respond eventually, but not today. Today she wanted to preserve the memory of salt air and freedom, of walking beside the sea with Adrian and pretending, just for a moment, that they were ordinary people, with ordinary futures stretching before them. That evening, they resumed their customary pattern of reading in the library after dinner. Adrian had selected a volume of poetry, Blake's Songs of Innocence and Experience, and read aloud while Vivienne worked on organising the newest additions to her collection of oral histories. And we are put on earth a little space, he read, that we may learn to bear the beams of love. Vivienne's pen stilled. Do you believe that? That we are here to learn such lessons? I am beginning to. He closed the book, marking his place with a ribbon. 3 months ago, I would have said we are here merely to fulfill our duties and await whatever comes after. Now I think perhaps there is more to it. Perhaps the lesson is in the living itself. You have changed since I arrived. As have you. The woman I met at Lady Pembroke's gathering would not have waded into the ocean with such abandon. The man I met would not have suggested it. They looked at each other across the lamplight space between them, and Vivienne felt the weight of all they were not saying. She loved him. The knowledge had crept up on her gradually, then all at once, like dawn breaking over the Kent countryside. She loved his intelligence, his dry humour, his unexpected capacity for joy despite the shadow under which he lived. She loved how he listened when she spoke, how he valued her thoughts, how he had given her purpose when she had been drifting. But loving him meant knowing she would lose him, knowing that every shared moment brought them closer to an ending she could not prevent. Vivian. Her name in his mouth carried its own confession. Before he could continue, a knock at the library door interrupted them. Mrs. Thornwell entered, her expression apologetic. "Forgive the intrusion, Your Grace, but you have an unexpected visitor. Mr. Marcus Claymore has arrived and insists on seeing you immediately." Adrian's expression shuttered, warmth draining away to be replaced by something cold and hard. Marcus. Of course he has. Vivian had heard Adrian speak of his cousin, the man who would inherit Windermere upon Adrian's death. The distaste in Adrian's tone whenever Marcus's name arose had told her everything she needed to know about their relationship. "Shall I tell him you are indisposed?" Mrs. Thornwell asked, her tone suggesting she would gladly deliver such news. "No. Show him to the blue drawing room. I will join him presently." Adrian waited until the housekeeper departed before turning to Vivian. "I apologize. This evening is ruined. Family cannot always be avoided, even when one wishes to. Marcus is family by the thinnest of connections and a source of endless aggravation by choice." He rose, straightening his waistcoat. "I suspect this will not be a brief conversation. You should retire for the evening." But Vivian remained in the library long after Adrian departed, her mind turning over implications. Why would Marcus appear unannounced at Windermere? What did he want that could not wait for a formal invitation? The answers arrived the following morning over breakfast, when Adrian joined her, looking as though he had not slept. "Marcus has heard rumours of my condition," he said without preamble. "Apparently London physicians are not as discreet as one might hope. He came to assess my health for himself and, more importantly, to survey what will soon be his property. That is unconscionable. That is Marcus." Adrian poured coffee with hands that trembled slightly. "He walked through the house last night as though taking inventory. Asked pointed questions about the estate's finances, the condition of the tenant farms, future expenditures. He barely bothered pretending concern for my welfare. What did you tell him? That my health is my own affair, and that Windermere will pass to him when I am dead, not before." It did not improve his temper. Adrian set down his cup. "He asked about you as well." Vivian felt her stomach tighten. "What did you tell him?" "That you are cataloguing my library and documenting the estate's history. He found that amusing, suggested I was wasting resources on sentimental projects when the money could be better spent elsewhere." Adrian's jaw tightened. "I informed him that how I spend my resources is not his concern until he inherits the title. He will change everything when he does inherit, will he not?" "Everything he can." Adrian looked out the breakfast room window toward the gardens beyond. "He spoke last night of selling off portions of the estate, increasing rents, eliminating what he called unnecessary expenses. The school I helped establish for tenant children. He considers it foolish charity. The improvements to workers' cottages. Wasteful sentimentality. Can you not prevent it? Surely there are legal protections that could be established. I have been consulting with my solicitors, but entailed estates limit what can be done. The title and primary holdings must pass to Marcus. What I can protect are the people to some degree. Trusts can be established, provisions written into leases, protections enacted that will survive my death." He turned back to face her. "That is why the documentation project matters so much. It creates a record, a history that cannot be erased, even if Marcus attempts to transform everything else." They spent that morning working with renewed purpose. Vivian transcribing notes while Adrian drafted letters to his solicitors, detailing precisely what protections he wanted established. The oral history project had evolved beyond simple documentation into something more urgent, a bulwark against the changes Marcus would inevitably bring. Marcus himself remained at Windermere for 3 days, a presence that cast a pall over the household. He was everything Adrian was not. Loud where Adrian was measured, dismissive where Adrian was thoughtful, concerned only with immediate advantage rather than long-term stewardship. On the final afternoon of his visit, Vivian encountered Marcus in the portrait gallery. She had been studying the paintings, noting family resemblances, and preparing questions for Adrian about particular ancestors whose stories might be worth recording. "Miss Hartley," Marcus said, his tone making her name sound vaguely improper. "Still cataloguing, I see. Tell me, how much is my dear cousin paying you for this service? My compensation is between His Grace and myself." How discreet. Though I wonder what services exactly warrant such extended residence. His implication was clear and insulting. Vivian kept her voice level through force of will. "The Duke's library is extensive, and the oral history project requires considerable time. If you have concerns about household expenditures, I suggest you address them with His Grace directly." "Oh, I have. Adrian was quite defensive about your position here." "Interesting, given that he has always been so proper, so concerned with appearances." Marcus stepped closer. "A word of advice, Miss Hartley. Whatever arrangement you have with my cousin, remember that it ends when he does. When I inherit, there will be no need for cataloguers or sentimental historical projects. Then I shall consider myself fortunate to serve a master who values such things while he lives." She swept past him, heart pounding with suppressed anger. In the library, she found Adrian at his desk, his expression dark. "Marcus has just departed, thankfully. 3 days of his company was 2 days too many." He looked up at her. "Did he trouble you?" "Nothing I could not manage. He suggested, rather unsubtly, that our arrangement was improper. I corrected his assumptions forcefully." Adrian rose from his desk. "Vivian, I need you to understand something. Whatever Marcus insinuates, whatever he believes, you are here because I need you here. Not merely for the work, though that matters greatly, but because you have given me something I thought lost. You have given me a reason to wake each morning that extends beyond merely counting the days until I do not wake at all." The raw honesty of his words left her momentarily speechless. "Adrian, I am not asking you to respond. I am merely stating a fact. These months with you have been the most meaningful of my life. Whatever time remains, I am grateful you are here to share it." Before she could respond, a bout of dizziness overtook him. He reached for the desk, missing, and would have fallen had Vivian not moved quickly to support him. Together they managed to get him to the chair. "Your heart?" she asked urgently. "Yes. The exertion of dealing with Marcus these past days, I think. Give me a moment." She knelt beside him, monitoring his pulse, noting how irregular it felt beneath her fingers. This was worse than previous episodes. The rhythm, more erratic. Fear clutched at her chest, but she pushed it aside, focusing on what needed to be done. "I am sending for Dr. Pembridge. It will pass. You do not know that, and I refuse to risk it." She called for Mrs. Thornwell, who appeared with her characteristic speed. The physician arrived within 2 hours. His examination was thorough, his expression grave when he emerged from Adrian's chambers. "The heart is deteriorating more rapidly than I had hoped, Miss Hartley. These episodes will become more frequent." His Grace mentioned stress from his cousin's visit, which likely triggered this particular incident, but the underlying weakness continues to progress. "How long?" she hated asking. Hated reducing Adrian's life to a calculation of days or months. Difficult to say with certainty. 2 months perhaps, possibly 3 if he is fortunate and avoids significant exertion. I have left instructions for his care and a tonic that may ease the symptoms, but I can do little else. After the doctor departed, Vivian sat in her chambers, staring at nothing. 2 to 3 months, not the 6 they had started with. The mathematics of mortality had shifted, and with it, the weight of every moment grew heavier. A soft knock at her door drew her from dark thoughts. Mrs. Thornwell entered, carrying a tea tray. "You should eat something, miss. You have been caring for everyone else all day." "Thank you, Mrs. Thornwell." The housekeeper set down the tray but did not immediately depart. "If I might speak plainly, Miss Hartley." "Of course. In 30 years of service to this family, I have never seen His Grace as content as he has been these past months. Whatever time God grants him, you have made those days a blessing. Do not doubt that." The kindness in her words very nearly undid Vivian's composure. I care for him very deeply, Mrs. Thornwell. More than is wise, I suspect. Wisdom and the heart rarely align, miss. Best to acknowledge what you feel rather than pretend otherwise. After the housekeeper departed, Vivian sat with her tea growing cold, accepting what she had been trying to deny. She loved Adrian Claymore, Duke of Windermere, and she would lose him. But until that day arrived, she would make certain every remaining moment counted for something more than mere preparation for death. She would make them count for life. The beginning of the 4th month arrived with summer's peak heat settling over Windermere. Vivian had grown increasingly attuned to Adrian's condition, recognizing the subtle signs that preceded his episodes. The slight pallor, the way his breathing would shift, the tension around his eyes. She watched him more carefully now, aware that Dr. Pembridge's revised prognosis hung over them, like a shadow shortening by the day. Adrian had begun to notice the deterioration himself. Simple tasks left him winded. The walks they had once taken across the estate grounds now required frequent pauses. Yet paradoxically, as his physical strength waned, something else seemed to grow stronger between them, an intensity born of knowing their time was measured in weeks rather than months. One morning, Vivian discovered Adrian in the library earlier than usual, bent over documents spread across his desk. Dark circles shadowed his eyes, suggesting he had slept poorly, if at all. "You should be resting," she said, setting down the correspondence she had been carrying. "I cannot rest. Not when there is so much yet to be done." He gestured at the papers before him. Legal protections for the tenants, trusts to be established, provisions that Marcus cannot overturn. "My solicitors assure me it is possible, but the details are maddening." Vivian moved to stand beside him, scanning the dense legal language. "Let me help. 2 sets of eyes will make quicker work of this." They spent the morning reviewing documents, Vivian taking notes, while Adrian explained what each provision meant for the people of Windermere. The project had become more urgent since Marcus's visit, his callous attitude toward the estate's people spurring Adrian to ensure their protection would survive his death. "There," Adrian said finally, signing the last document with a flourish. "It is done. Marcus will inherit the title and the entailed property, but the people will have protections he cannot circumvent for at least 10 years. By then, perhaps the law will have changed, or Marcus will have grown a conscience. Though I doubt the latter. You have done well by them," Vivian said quietly. "I have done what I should have done years ago, instead of merely accepting that Marcus would undo everything I valued." He set down his pen, regarding her steadily. "Vivian, there is something else I must tell you." The seriousness of his tone made her pulse quicken. "What is it?" "I have made arrangements for you as well. A property, a small cottage by the sea in Sussex near Brighton. It is yours, in your name, purchased outright. No one can take it from you, not Margaret, not Marcus, not anyone. Additionally, there is a fund, substantial enough to provide income for life if managed prudently. You will never need to depend on anyone's charity again." Vivian stared at him, momentarily robbed of speech. "Adrian, that is too much. The compensation we agreed upon is separate from this. Consider this a gift from someone who has come to value you beyond mere employment." He rose from his desk, moving closer. "These months with you have been the most meaningful of my existence. You asked me once what I dreamed of. I have realized that my dream has been simply this: to live before I die. You have given me that gift. Allow me to give you the means to live as you choose. I do not know what to say. Say you will accept it. Say that when I am gone, you will pursue every dream you confessed to me in this very room. Travel, learn languages, see the cathedrals and libraries of Europe. Live the life you were meant to have." Tears blurred her vision. "How can I think of such things when—" She stopped, unable to finish the thought. "When I am dying." He smiled gently. "That is precisely when you must think of them. My death is certain, Vivian. Your life is not. Do not let my ending diminish your beginning." Before she could respond, a crash of thunder rattled the windows. They both turned to see dark clouds rolling across the sky, transforming the bright morning into premature twilight. "A storm approaches," Adrian observed. The words felt prophetic. Within minutes, rain lashed against the windows with violent intensity. Wind howled around the manor's corners, and somewhere in the house, a shutter tore loose, banging rhythmically. "I should check the upper floors," Adrian said, starting toward the door. "No, you should rest. Let the staff manage it." But he was already moving, and Vivienne had no choice but to follow. They climbed to the second floor, where several windows had been left open, rain soaking the carpets. As they worked to secure them, a tremendous crack split the air. "The roof," Adrian said, his face draining of colour. They ran toward the east wing, where the oldest section of the manor stood. The corridor filled with dust and the acrid smell of wet plaster. Part of the ceiling had collapsed, timber and debris blocking the passage ahead. Vivienne felt Adrian's hand close around her arm, pulling her back just as another section gave way. He turned, shielding her with his body as fragments rained down. They stumbled backward together, Adrian losing his footing on the wet floor. They fell hard, Vivienne cushioned by his arms even as she heard him gasp in pain. "Adrian!" She scrambled to assess him. "Are you hurt?" "My ribs," he managed, his breathing laboured. "I think something broke." Mrs. Thornwell and 2 footmen appeared, summoned by the noise. Together they helped Adrian back to his chambers, every movement drawing sharp intakes of breath from him. Dr. Pembridge was sent for immediately. The physician's examination confirmed 2 cracked ribs, but more concerning was the strain the incident had placed on Adrian's already weakened heart. "You must remain in bed for at least a week," Dr. Pembridge instructed. "Any exertion at all could trigger a severe episode." After the doctor departed, Vivienne sat in the chair beside Adrian's bed, her own hands trembling with delayed shock. "You should not have shielded me. You could have been killed." "Better me than you," he replied, his voice tight with pain. "The world has more need of you than it does of me." "That is not true." "It is, and you know it." He reached for her hand, his grip weak. "Promise me something, Vivienne. When the time comes, do not waste your grief on me. Remember me, yes, but live. That is all I ask." She could not promise that. Not yet. So she simply held his hand and stayed as laudanum pulled him towards sleep. The week of his recovery tested them both. Adrian chafed at the enforced inactivity, while Vivienne divided her time between continuing the documentation project and sitting with him during his waking hours. They read together, talked about everything and nothing, and in the quiet moments when words seemed insufficient, simply existed in each other's presence. It was during one such silence that Adrian spoke words that changed everything. "I am in love with you, Vivienne." She had been reading aloud but stopped mid-sentence, the book forgotten in her lap. "Adrian, I know I have no right to say it. I know that loving me can bring you nothing but pain. But I cannot die without you knowing the truth. These months with you have been the most precious of my life. Not because you helped me organize my affairs or document Windermere's history, but simply because you were here. Because every morning I woke, knowing I would see you, speak with you, exist in your presence for another day." Vivienne set the book aside with shaking hands. "You must know I feel the same. I hoped. I did not dare assume." "I love you," she said, the words emerging with fierce clarity. "I have fought against it, knowing how this must end, but I cannot deny it any longer. I love you, Adrian Claymore, and I will love you until the moment you leave this world, and likely beyond it." He pulled her closer with his uninjured arm, and she went willingly, careful of his ribs, but needing the contact as much as he did. They remained that way for long moments, holding each other while rain continued to fall outside, the storm having settled into steady persistence. "We cannot marry," Vivienne said finally. "I will not be remembered as the Duchess who had her husband for mere weeks. I want to be Vivienne to you, not a title." "Then Vivienne you shall remain," Adrian agreed. "Though I will ensure legally that you are protected as thoroughly as if you were my wife. Marcus will have no claim on you, no authority to interfere with the provisions I have made." The days that followed their confession brought a strange peace. They had acknowledged what lay between them, named it and claimed it, even knowing time was their enemy. Adrian recovered slowly from his injuries. though Dr. Pembridge privately told Vivian that the trauma had accelerated the heart's deterioration. "How long?" she asked, dreading the answer. 2 months at most. Possibly less if there are further incidents. 2 months. 8 weeks. 56 days. However she calculated it, the number remained brutally finite. But they would make them count. They would fill every remaining day with something worth remembering, worth having lived for. And when the end came, as it inevitably would, Vivian would face it, knowing she had given Adrian the one thing he had been denied his entire life, the experience of being truly, completely loved. The final weeks of the 4th month bled into the 5th, with autumn beginning its slow creep across Windermere. The leaves had not yet turned, but something in the air spoke of approaching change. A coolness in the morning mist, the angle of light shifting perceptibly. Adrian felt the seasonal shift as a mirror of his own decline, inevitable and irreversible. Dr. Pembridge visited weekly now, his examinations growing briefer as treatment options dwindled. On his most recent visit, he had spoken to both Adrian and Vivian together, acknowledging what they all knew, but had avoided stating plainly. 2 months at most, likely less, he said, his tone gentle but firm. The heart is failing more rapidly than any prognosis suggested. "I am sorry, Your Grace. I wish the news were different." Adrian had received this with characteristic composure, thanking the physician and showing him out. Only after the doctor's carriage had disappeared down the drive did he allow himself to sink into a chair, his face grey. 2 months, he repeated. The horizon keeps drawing closer, never further away. Vivian knelt beside him, taking his hand. "Then we make these 2 months matter more than all the years that came before. How very like you to find resolve where I find only despair. One of us must." She squeezed his fingers gently. "And you have given me so much, Adrian. Allow me to give you this, the certainty that whatever time remains, you will not face it alone." That conversation marked a shift in how they approached each day. There would be no more pretending that Adrian might improve, no more carefully avoiding mention of the end approaching. Instead, they spoke of it plainly, making plans with the time they had, rather than against the time they did not. The oral history project reached completion. Vivian's final journal contained stories spanning 3 generations of Windermere's people, their voices preserved in her careful script. Adrian wrote a preface, his hand shaking but determined, explaining why this record mattered. "Let it be known," he wrote, "that an estate is not land or buildings, but the people who give it life. Their stories, their struggles and triumphs, their connection to this place. These are Windermere's true legacy. I am grateful to Miss Vivian Hartley for ensuring that legacy will endure." Marcus returned unexpectedly one afternoon, bringing with him a London solicitor. His purpose became clear immediately. He wished to establish Adrian's mental incompetence, thereby allowing Marcus to assume management of the estate before Adrian's death. "It is merely a formality," Marcus said, his tone suggesting anything but formality. To ensure a smooth transition during this difficult time, Adrian, though weak, met his cousin's challenge with cold fury. He produced the completed documentation project, the meticulously organized legal protections, the correspondence with his own solicitors, proving his continued mental acuity. The London solicitor, after reviewing the materials, could find no grounds for declaring Adrian incompetent. "Your Grace's mind remains entirely sound," the man admitted, gathering his papers. "I apologize for the intrusion." After they departed, Adrian collapsed into a chair, the exertion having cost him dearly. "That was Marcus's final attempt to seize control before I die. At least I had the satisfaction of defeating him one last time." "You did more than defeat him," Vivian said. "You ensured everything you value will be protected, thanks to you." Adrian reached for her hand. "None of this would exist without you, Vivian. The documentation, the legal protections, the realization that my death need not erase what mattered in my life. You gave me that clarity." In the quiet evenings that followed, Adrian began writing letters. Not correspondence for business or estate matters, but personal letters addressed to Vivian, sealed and dated for the months following his death. "One for each month of the first year," he explained when she discovered him at his desk late one night. "So you will know I am thinking of you even when I cannot speak the words aloud. Adrian, I do not need letters to remember you. Perhaps not. But I need to write them. I need to believe that some part of me will continue to exist in your life after I am gone. He set down his pen, regarding her with an intensity that made her breath catch. I love you, Vivian Hartley. I need you to know that truth will not end when my heart stops beating. She crossed to him, careful of his increasing fragility, and kissed him gently. It was their first kiss, tender and bittersweet, tasting of tears neither would acknowledge. When they finally drew apart, both understood that something essential had been sealed between them. A bond that would transcend whatever separation death imposed. I love you, she whispered against his temple. I will love you until my own heart stops. And perhaps beyond. The days grew shorter as September advanced. Adrian tired more easily, requiring assistance for tasks he had managed alone just weeks before. Vivienne became his constant companion, reading to him when exhaustion made his own vision blur, helping him dress when his hands trembled too much to manage buttons, simply sitting beside him during the long hours when pain made speech impossible. Mrs. Thornwell proved invaluable, her decades of service making her both discreet and efficient. She ensured Adrian's comfort without unnecessary fuss, brought Vivienne meals when the younger woman forgot to eat, and maintained the household's smooth operation despite the shadow hanging over Windermere. One evening, as autumn rain drummed against the library windows, Adrian made a request that surprised Vivienne. Dance with me, he said. Here, as we did before, but knowing what we know now. Adrian, you are too weak. I am dying, Vivienne. Let me have this one thing while I still can. Oh. She helped him stand, supporting most of his weight as they moved slowly between the bookshelves. There was no music save the rain's rhythm, no grace in their shuffling steps, but the intimacy of the moment transcended such concerns. They held each other as though movement itself was secondary to simply being together, bodies pressed close, hearts beating in temporary synchrony. Thank you, Adrian murmured when they finally stopped, breathless and exhausted. Thank you for showing me what it means to truly live before dying. You showed me the same, Vivienne replied, guiding him back to his chair. You gave me purpose when I had none, hope when I expected nothing. Whatever grief comes, I will bear it gladly for having known you. The month ended with Adrian confined increasingly to his chambers, his strength fading visibly. Yet his mind remained sharp, his concern for Windermere's future and Vivienne's welfare never wavering. He reviewed documents repeatedly, ensuring every provision was ironclad, every protection legally sound. Marcus will challenge these when I am gone, he told his solicitors during their final visit. Ensure he finds no weakness to exploit. At night, when pain medication allowed brief respite, Adrian would summon Vivienne to his bedside. They would talk quietly about memories they had created together, about the future she would have after he was gone, about love and loss, and the strange grace found in accepting both. I should regret meeting you, Adrian said one such night. You have made dying so much harder, because now I have something precious to lose. But I cannot regret it, Vivienne. These months with you have been worth every moment of pain that preceded them, and all that remains to come. Nor can I regret it, she replied, holding his hand as he drifted towards sleep. I would choose this grief 1,000 times rather than never having known you at all. As October approached, bringing with it the final chapter of their story, both understood they had accomplished something rare. They had loved completely within the shadow of death, and that love had transformed them both beyond measure. The 6th month arrived with October's chill settling over Windermere. The trees had surrendered their leaves to autumn winds, leaving branches stark against grey skies. Inside the manor, Adrian's condition had deteriorated to the point where even small movements exhausted him. Pain had become his constant companion, and Dr. Pembridge finally convinced him to accept regular doses of laudanum. The pain serves no purpose, Your Grace, the physician said gently. Allow yourself this relief. Adrian had resisted for weeks, fearing the medication would cloud his mind during his final days. But the agony had grown unbearable, stealing what little strength remained. Very well, he conceded, his voice barely above a whisper, but only enough to make it tolerable. I need my mind clear for what remains. Vivian measured each dose carefully, administering the tincture when Adrian's face went grey with suffering. She had learned to read the signs, the tightening around his eyes, the shallow breathing, the way his hands would clench involuntarily. The laudanum brought relief, but also stole hours from them. Hours when Adrian would drift in a twilight state between waking and sleeping. During one of Dr. Pembridge's visits, the physician asked to speak with both of them. His expression left no room for hope. I must be frank with you both. We are speaking of weeks now, perhaps days. The heart is failing rapidly. There will be little warning when the end comes. Adrian received this news with the same composure he had shown throughout his illness. How long precisely? 2 weeks, possibly 3. I am sorry, Your Grace. I wish I could offer more time. After the doctor departed, Adrian turned to Vivian. Then we must use what remains wisely. Despite his weakness, Adrian insisted on gathering the principal tenants and household staff. Mrs. Thornwell arranged for them to come to the manor on a crisp afternoon when Adrian felt strong enough to receive them. They assembled in the drawing room, concern etched on every face. Adrian, propped in a chair with pillows supporting his fragile frame, addressed them with quiet authority. You have served my family and this estate faithfully, some of you for generations. I have called you here to formally present Miss Vivian Hartley as my protector and friend. After I am gone, I ask that you extend to her the same loyalty and respect you have shown me. There was silence for a moment. Then Samuel Whitmore stepped forward. The old farmer's voice cracked with emotion. Your Grace, you saved my family from ruin years ago when the harvest failed. You never spoke of it, never asked for gratitude, but we remember. I give you my word that Miss Hartley will be looked after as you would wish. Others murmured agreement, several wiping tears. Adrian thanked them, exhaustion evident in every line of his face. After they departed, he sagged in his chair. That is done, at least. They will remember Vivian. They will protect you if Marcus causes trouble. You have ensured everything that can be ensured, Vivian said, helping him back to his chambers. You can rest now. Not yet. There is something I must do first. That evening, despite her protests, Adrian insisted on dictating final letters to his solicitors. He spoke slowly, pausing frequently to catch his breath, but his instructions were clear and thorough. Every detail of the estate's management, every protection for the tenants, every provision for Vivian's future, all were meticulously documented. When he finally finished, dawn was breaking outside the windows. Vivian had remained beside him throughout the night, writing down his words, helping him when the pain grew too intense to continue. Thank you, he said, his eyes closing, for everything. 2 days later, another letter arrived from Margaret. Vivian recognized the handwriting with weary resignation. Her sister's tone had shifted from impatient to demanding. Your continued absence is causing talk, Margaret wrote. Thomas has been questioned by his associates about why his wife's sister remains at an unmarried duke's estate. You must return to London immediately or face the consequences to our family's reputation. Vivian folded the letter and placed it with the others in her desk drawer. She would not dignify it with a response. Margaret had made clear throughout Vivian's life that family bonds only mattered when convenient. Now, when Adrian needed her most, Vivian would not abandon him to satisfy her sister's social anxieties. As October's end approached, Adrian's lucid moments grew fewer. The laudanum kept the worst pain at bay, but left him drifting, sometimes confused about where or when he was. Yet occasionally, usually in the early morning hours, clarity would return like a gift. On what would be their penultimate evening together, one such moment arrived. Adrian woke from his medication-induced fog with unusual alertness. Vivienne, he said, his voice stronger than it had been in days. Help me to the library, please, one last time. Adrian, you are too weak. I am dying. What further harm can it do? He attempted a smile. Indulge me this. With Mrs. Thornwell's assistance, they managed to get him downstairs. He leaned heavily on Vivian's shoulder, each step requiring effort that left him breathless. But when they reached the library, when he saw the familiar shelves and smelled the particular scent of old books and beeswax, something like peace settled over his features. "Here," he said. "This is where we began. Truly began. Do you remember? That afternoon when you first arrived and I showed you this room. I remember everything. Dance with me. One last time." There was no music, only the sound of their breathing and the soft rustle of Vivian's dress as she supported most of Adrian's weight. They moved slowly between the towering shelves, barely shuffling really, but to both of them it was a waltz as elegant as any performed in London's grandest ballrooms. "Thank you for giving me life when I had resigned myself to death," Adrian whispered against her temple. "Thank you for showing me what it means to be truly seen, truly known, truly loved. You did the same for me," Vivian replied, tears streaming down her face. "You gave me purpose and hope when I had neither." They stood swaying gently until Adrian's strength failed entirely. Vivienne guided him back to his chambers, where he collapsed onto the bed, the brief exertion having drained what little reserves remained. The final night arrived without ceremony. Adrian slept peacefully for the first time in weeks, his breathing steady, his features relaxed. Vivian remained in the chair beside his bed, holding his hand, watching the slow rise and fall of his chest. She spoke to him softly, recounting memories they had created together. The first day at Windermere, their journey to Brighton, the picnic by the lake, the evening he had first told her he loved her. All of it poured out in a gentle stream of words meant to ease his passage. As the first light of dawn touched the horizon, Adrian's eyes opened. For a brief, luminous moment, complete clarity returned to his gaze. He looked at Vivian with such love, such gratitude, that she felt her heart might break from the beauty of it. "Thank you," he whispered, "for all of it, every moment." His eyes closed, his breath released slowly, gently, and did not come again. Vivian sat holding his hand as morning light filled the room, feeling the warmth slowly leave his fingers. She did not weep, not yet. Instead, she spoke to him as though he could still hear, telling him she would keep her promise, that she would live the life they had planned together, that his legacy would endure. Only when Mrs. Thornwell entered and saw what had passed, did Vivian finally allow herself to crumble. The housekeeper held her while she wept, the grief that had been held at bay for months, finally breaking free. Adrian Claymore, Duke of Windermere, was gone, but the love they had shared, forged in the shadow of death and made precious by its brevity, would remain with Vivian for all the days of her life. 3 months after Adrian's death, autumn had returned to Windermere, bringing with it a melancholy that seemed to settle into the very stones of the manor. Vivian had remained throughout the summer, honouring the promise she had made to Adrian in those final days. She had stayed to ensure his wishes were carried out, to smooth the transition of power to Marcus, and perhaps most importantly, to say a proper goodbye to the place that had become her home. The funeral had drawn mourners from across the county. Tenant families, neighbouring gentry, household staff both current and former, all came to pay respects to the Duke who had cared for them with quiet dignity. Vivian had been surprised to see Lady Pembroke among the attendees, her former employer arriving in a coach draped in black crepe. "Miss Hartley," Lady Pembroke had said after the service, her tone softer than Vivian remembered. "I was wrong about you. What you did for His Grace in his final months, the companionship you provided, it was a gift beyond measure." She had pressed Vivian's hand briefly. "Should you ever require a reference or assistance, you need only write to me." The unexpected kindness had nearly undone Vivian's composure. She had managed to thank Lady Pembroke before retreating to the manor's sanctuary, where grief waited to claim her in private. Marcus had assumed the title with unseemly haste, arriving at Windermere 3 days after the funeral with his solicitors and plans for immediate changes. Vivian had watched as he inventoried rooms, discussed which furnishings might be sold, calculated potential income from increased rents. Everything Adrian had feared about his cousin's stewardship proved true, yet Adrian's legal protections held firm. When Marcus attempted to dismiss long-serving staff, he discovered employment contracts that could not be broken without substantial financial penalty. When he proposed raising rents immediately, His solicitors informed him of the 10-year restrictions Adrian had legally established. When he suggested closing the school Adrian had founded, he learned it was funded by an irrevocable trust. "My cousin was remarkably thorough," Marcus had said, his tone suggesting this was not a compliment. He had turned his attention to Vivian. "And what of you, Miss Hartley? Surely your employment here has concluded." "I stay at the pleasure of the estate, not at yours," Vivian had replied coolly. "His Grace made provisions for my residence here during the transition period. When I depart, it will be of my own choosing." Marcus had not pressed the matter, constrained by the same legal framework that protected the tenants and staff. But his displeasure was evident in every interaction. Margaret's letters had grown increasingly strident. The most recent, which arrived in late September, abandoned all pretense of sisterly concern. "Your continued residence at Windermere after the Duke's death is beyond improper. It is scandalous," Margaret wrote in her sharp script. "Thomas has been questioned repeatedly by his associates about your situation. You must return to London immediately. We can no longer afford to house you, not with the gossip your behaviour has generated. You have made yourself unemployable as a companion. What do you intend to do?" Vivian had read the letter twice, then placed it with the others in a small leather case. She would not respond. Margaret had demonstrated throughout Vivian's life that family loyalty extended only as far as convenience allowed. Adrian had given Vivian the gift of independence, and she would not surrender it to appease a sister who had never truly valued her. The decision to leave Windermere came not from external pressure, but from internal recognition that her purpose there had been fulfilled. Adrian's legacy was secure. The oral history project sat in bound volumes in the library, a permanent record of the people who had given Windermere its soul. The legal protections would shield them from Marcus's worst impulses for years to come. It was time for Vivian to begin the life Adrian had made possible. On a cool October morning, Vivian stood before Adrian's grave one final time. The headstone was simple, bearing his name, dates, and the inscription she had suggested. "He learned to live before he died." Fresh wildflowers lay against the stone, placed there by tenant families who still mourn their duke. "I am keeping my promise," she said quietly to the silent earth. "I am going to live, Adrian, as you wished me to. Thank you for believing I was worth saving. Thank you for loving me. I will carry that love with me always." The journey to the Sussex coast took most of a day. As Vivian's hired coach approached the address Adrian's solicitors had provided, she caught her first glimpse of the cottage that was now hers. It sat on a gentle rise overlooking the sea, a modest structure of weathered stone with a slate roof and windows that faced the endless expanse of water. Inside, she discovered Adrian's final gift. The main room had been converted into a library, shelves lining every wall, filled with books he had carefully selected for her. Travel narratives and histories of European cities, French and Italian language primers, with detailed annotations in Adrian's familiar hand, collections of poetry and philosophy. Everything she would need to pursue the dreams they had discussed during those long evenings at Windermere. On the desk sat a sealed letter in his handwriting, dated the month before his death. With trembling fingers, Vivian broke the seal. "My dearest Vivian," it began, "if you are reading this, then you have found the cottage and the beginning of your new life. I have tried to anticipate what you might need for the adventures ahead. The books are merely a starting point. The world awaits you, and I have ensured you have the means to embrace it fully. Do not mourn me over long. Instead, live with the passion and purpose you brought to my final months. Travel to Florence and Rome. Stand in the cathedrals you have dreamed of seeing. Learn the languages that have intrigued you. Most importantly, allow yourself to love again when the time comes. My love for you does not require your perpetual solitude. It requires only that you live fully, completely, joyfully. That is how you honour what we shared. Yours always, Adrian." Vivian sat at the desk, tears streaming down her face, but also smiling through them. Adrian had thought of everything, even her tendency to retreat into grief, rather than face the future he had secured for her. The cottage became her refuge and workspace. She began writing immediately, not a formal biography of Adrian, but something more intimate and true. The story of a dying man who learned to live, and the woman who taught him how. She incorporated the oral histories they had collected, weaving together the voices of Windermere's people with Adrian's story, creating a tapestry of life lived with intention, despite, or perhaps because of, its brevity. The work consumed her through the winter. She wrote in the mornings when light streamed through the windows, revised in the afternoons while walking along the shore, and read late into the evening from Adrian's carefully curated collection. The words poured out of her, equal parts love letter and testament, grief and celebration. By spring, the manuscript was complete. She titled it simply 6 Months, A Testament to Life and Love, and published it anonymously through a London printer. She had no interest in notoriety or recognition. The book existed to preserve what she and Adrian had shared, and to honour his wish that their story might inspire others to embrace life rather than merely endure it. 1 year after Adrian's death, Vivian stood on the deck of a packet ship bound for France. The modest success of her book had supplemented the income from Adrian's trust, making travel not merely possible but comfortable. She carried little luggage, just enough for several months abroad, and a leather journal for recording her observations. The first months in France passed in a blur of discovery. She walked through Paris's ancient churches, stood before artworks she had only read about, practiced her halting French with patient shopkeepers and amused fellow travellers. From Paris, she travelled to Lyon, then south to the Mediterranean. In Florence, she spent weeks in the libraries and museums, fulfilling the dreams she had confessed to Adrian in Windermere's library. She learned Italian from a patient tutor, a widow herself who understood the particular freedom that came from starting life anew in middle age. Letters arrived regularly from England. Mrs. Thornwell wrote with news of Windermere, reporting that Marcus had proven less terrible than feared, constrained by Adrian's protections, and perhaps sobered by the responsibility of the title. Samuel Whitmore sent a brief note thanking her for the book, which had somehow found its way to the tenants despite its anonymous publication. His Grace would be proud, the old farmer wrote. You honoured him well. Even Lady Pembroke corresponded, sharing London gossip and asking about Vivian's travels with what seemed like genuine interest. Margaret never wrote, and Vivian found she did not miss her sister's letters. As autumn arrived once more, Vivian found herself in Rome, standing in St. Peter's Basilica, overwhelmed by the scale and beauty Adrian had described during their conversations. She thought of him constantly, but the grief had transformed into something gentler, a bittersweet awareness of loss balanced by gratitude for what they had shared. That evening, she opened the final letter from the set Adrian had prepared, the one marked for the first anniversary of his death. It was brief, just a few lines in his elegant script. 1 year has passed, my love. I hope you have travelled far, learned much, and begun to build the life you deserve. Do not look back with regret. Look forward with hope. And know that wherever you are, whatever you do, I am proud of you. Always, Adrian. Vivienne folded the letter carefully and placed it in her journal. Tomorrow she would continue her journey, perhaps to Naples or across to Greece. The world stretched before her, full of possibilities Adrian had made real through his love and sacrifice. She was 29 years old, independent, educated, and free. She had loved deeply and been loved in return. She had known grief, but also joy. And she had learned the most important lesson Adrian could teach, that life, however brief or uncertain, was meant to be lived fully, passionately, courageously. As she looked out over Rome's ancient streets, Vivian smiled, feeling Adrian's presence not as loss, but as blessing. She had kept her promise. She was living, truly living, for both of them. And somewhere, she believed, Adrian was smiling too.